The German Air Force in action. Sitting in the cockpit of the Eurofighters are absolute specialists, fighter pilots who are always prepared for an emergency.
It's a fighter, the archetype of a warrior who practically wages man-to-man combat here in the plane.
The German Air Force got started more than 6 decades ago. At that time, young jet pilots were trained in the United States in state-of-the-art jet planes and went through grueling years of training.
All the pilots were young. We had far too little experience to be able to handle such a racehorse.
German reunification also led to many changes to the German Air Force. A defensive army became a task force.
Every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we ensure safety in the airspace and in space.
Exercise alarm at Tactical Air Force Squadron 74 in Neuburg on the Danube. This is also where one of the NATO Quick Reaction Alert crews is stationed. Their mission? To protect the southern airspace of the Federal Republic of Germany, 24/7. A Quick Reaction Alert crew consists of 2 Eurofighter planes, fully armed and mission-ready. Within minutes, the fighter pilots are in their jets and ready for takeoff.
We managed to handle everything within 5 to 6 minutes, and then the plane is ready for takeoff, and then we're airborne.
Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Kiefer has been a Eurofighter pilot for 8 years. He has already been on 5 missions abroad, in the Baltic states, in Estonia, and in Jordan. Today, he's stationed in Neuburg. His job here is clearly defined.
The QRA, that's our basic mission. That is the Quick Reaction Alert, the alert crew to secure German airspace.
Roughly 28,000 servicemen and women are currently serving in the German Air Force. They monitor German airspace and in an emergency defend sovereignty over the airspace with their fighter aircraft. The German Air Force is highly mobile and is also deployed abroad during relief, rescue and evacuation missions, but also in case of conflict.
We can bridge time and space far differently than other forces. As much as I appreciate my fellow soldiers in the Army, if you look at how long it takes a tank battalion to move long distances here, how long it takes a naval fleet unit, a ship, the speed it travels, fighter planes can fly to other countries within minutes. It allows us to escalate quickly. We can quickly show a potential adversary, hey, we're here. Stop right there. But we can de-escalate just as quickly, which is also very important. When the crisis has hopefully calmed down again, allowing us to say, okay, we'll withdraw our planes. And all at once, the crisis has de-escalated.
The Eurofighter is currently the most modern aerial weapons system of the German Air Force. A multi-role combat aircraft capable of engaging both air and ground targets. The jet accelerates to more than 2,000 kilometers per hour and reaches an altitude of almost 17 kilometers. It has a maximum rate of climb of 315 meters per second. The jet is armed with a 27mm cannon, air-to-air missiles, and various combinations of guided and unguided bombs. Emergency drills are conducted constantly. Today's scenario: an aircraft in German airspace is not responding to radio signals. The fictitious target is represented by a Lithuanian military aircraft. The interceptors are getting ready. The Eurofighters are ready for taxi. At the tower, the so-called flight lead obtains taxiing clearance.
Smoke-free Donau Tower, good morning. Numbers are correct. Taxiing approved.
One after another, the Eurofighters proceed down the taxiway. The jets stop at a parking area called the Last Chance. This is where the final check of the fighter planes takes place. The flight crew releases the safety on the weapons systems, and the pilots arm their ejection seats. The fighters are ready for takeoff and are waiting for takeoff clearance from the air traffic controllers in the tower. They are responsible for all flight operations at the airbase.
It's always possible that a pilot may have to abort takeoff. That's why, before giving clearance for takeoff, I switched the traffic lights to red, so that no one else will be driving along there. An aborted takeoff could also occur due to birds or some other technical problems with the aircraft. Before I give clearance for takeoff, I check the runway to see if it's really clear. Yes, we always hope nothing will happen.
The tower gives the Eurofighters clearance for takeoff. The flight lead confirms takeoff clearance and throttles up the engine. The other pilot follows him according to the previously determined start intervals.
We go up in the air because someone needs some form of assistance. You might call it a kind of air police duty in the sense of his radio's not working, for example. Then we'll escort him to the nearest airport.
The engines develop enormous thrust. After a short distance, the fighter jet lifts off the ground. There is a deafening noise thundering in the air. In a few seconds, the landing gears retracted and the aircraft have disappeared in the sky. Only now do the pilots receive their mission.
Right down to different variations, as we saw with 9/11, a potentially renegade scenario where an aircraft could be used as a terrorist weapon, and in that case, we're also requested and thus also provide assistance within the scope of capabilities and the legal playing field.
In concert with the other branches of the German armed forces, the German Air Force has also had missions abroad since the 1990s. From air surveillance to combat missions.
Airspace surveillance, which we also do here in Germany, is something we also now and do on and off of the Baltic states for 2 4-month assignments, almost 8 months a year. So we've now just returned to the Baltic states, here in Estonia, with 4 Eurofighters to guarantee the security of the airspace there.
As a multi-role combat aircraft, the Eurofighter can be equipped with laser and GPS-guided bombs for use against ground targets. The GBU-48 remote-controlled bomb is also used.
Kilo 3-1 is ready. It's ready. Right on, ready. Turning in right, start of run, Kilo 3-1.
The GBU-48 is a 500-kilogram glider bomb capable of engaging point targets with precision. With its adjustable wings, the bomb steers autonomously to its target in freefall. The beginnings of German military aviation go back more than 100 years. It was balloons that armies around the world began using to conquer the skies at the end of the 19th century. This provided the capability of conducting reconnaissance on and even fighting adversaries over long distances. A military advantage that German forces also achieved. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Harald Potempa is a military historian at the German Armed Forces. His doctoral thesis was on the Royal Bavarian Air Force in the First World War.
At the end of the 19th century, artillery developed a range of 5, 6, 7, 8 kilometers, where the gunner on the ground has a slight problem seeing 8 kilometers into the distance. So he needed an artillery observer in a balloon. This continues at the beginning of the 20th century. From 1900, the first flights, successful flights, by the airships of Count Zeppelin. And so in the first decade of the 20th century, in addition to the balloons, the airship suddenly appeared as military weaponry in the arsenals of the German armed forces before the First World War.
New technologies have always been utilized and advanced by the military. The step from balloon to mobile airship was only made possible by the development of reliable lightweight engines, such as the 85-horsepower piston engine built by the Kötting brothers in 1908. But pioneers in flight live dangerously. Again and again, serious accidents and crashes occur. Prominent patrons of German aviators include Kaiser Wilhelm II and his Technophile brother, Heinrich of Prussia. From the beginning, they are convinced of the great military benefits of airships. They allow for surveillance of the enemy, followed by bombardment.
The brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Prince Heinrich of Prussia, he also had many patents, by the way. One thing that has been totally forgotten, I believe to this day, is that he invented the windscreen wiper for the automobile. He invented marine boots for the Navy, and much more. He was technically gifted, and above all, he was extremely curious.
The airships soon have competition. The brothers Wilbur and Orville Wright succeed in 1903 in what was probably the first controlled flight with an engine-driven aircraft. The U.S. aviation pioneers offer their Wright Flyer to the U.S. Army. However, the Army initially graciously declined. The Wright Flyer A is a 550-kilogram two-seater biplane. Driven by a water-cooled four-cylinder inline engine with just under 30 horsepower, the Flyer reached a speed of about 60 kilometers per hour. In 1909, the Wright brothers demonstrate their biplane on the Tempelhof field near Berlin. In doing so, they inspired the Prussian military, which had initially favored airships.
From around 1910, the military began doing what it had already done with balloons. Does the airplane have military potential? Answer, yes. And how can I test this? By creating a test squadron, detachment, whatever you want to call it. This happened in 1910, not so far away from here, in Döberitz, in the Döberitzer Heide. And the Kingdom of Bavaria then followed suit in 1912 in Schleißheim.
Near Munich, in the direct vicinity of the Electoral Palace, the airfield of the Royal Bavarian Air Force is built. Today, it's the site of one of Germany's largest aeronautics exhibitions. One highlight is the Libelle, or Dragonfly, monoplane from 1909, invented by aviator pioneer Hans Grade. The lightweight flying machine, made of bamboo, canvas, and piano wire, is considered the first aircraft to be developed and built independently in Germany. At this time, there's endless enthusiasm for flying. Prince Heinrich of Prussia is also enthralled by the new flying machines. So in 1910, the prince earns his pilot's license number 38 from aviation pioneer August Euler. The first aircraft to be used by the Prussian Army is the Farman III. From 1910, the first German military pilots are trained on this type of aircraft. In the same year, the U.S. Army is already testing the dropping of bombs with the Farman III. The big problem, especially in Germany, is still the availability of powerful yet lightweight aircraft engines. For this reason, the Kaiser Award for the best German aircraft engine is announced in 1912. The National Flight Fundraising Drive, which brings in over 7 million marks, also serves to promote military aviation and training. Pilots today no longer have any issues with the performance of their engines. The two engines of the Eurofighter generate a thrust of 60, with afterburners even 90 kilonewtons. That corresponds to approximately 35 to 45,000 horsepower per engine. The technical group of the Tactical Air Force Squadron 74 in Neuburg is the material and logistical base of the squadron. It ensures that the Eurofighters in the fleet are always in perfect operating condition. Entire engines can also be replaced here.
Kaichi, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Move front and rear.
The modular twin-shaft engine consists of a total of 1,800 parts.
Stop!
The soldiers of the Maintenance and Weapons Squadron are on duty around the clock. Operational readiness of the Eurofighter has the highest priority.
There are various specialists for the Eurofighter. There are mechanical and electronic specialists. Mechanical specialists can be aircraft mechanics responsible for the hydraulics or for the engines, for example. Then come the rescue system crew or the flight equipment crew. They're responsible for the pilot's flight suit or even the pilot's ejection seat. They're followed by the materials crew. They're responsible for the structure and for the fiber composites of the aircraft. In the avionics crew are the RF engineers, responsible for the aircraft's radar and self-defense systems. Add to this the automatic control engineers, along with the guidance and navigation control engineers.
It fits, it fits.
In total, the 7 soldiers require just under 20 minutes for an engine change. After the engine has been replaced, the jet is subjected to a rigorous test procedure. In the so-called acceptance run, the new engine is put through the ropes. For safety reasons, the stress test is conducted on a special test stand. The test run takes place behind thick concrete walls and armored glass. Now, the engine is powered up. Testing of the afterburner, which harnesses 90 kilonewtons of thrust, is also a mandatory step. Only when the Eurofighter has successfully passed the test will it be put back into service. A tense moment in the tower of Tactical Air Force Squadron 74 in Neuburg on the Danube. In a few seconds, the Eurofighters will be touching down on the airfield. They're returning from their training mission. The aircraft located in their airspace was successfully identified. The Eurofighter is currently the most modern flying weapons system of the German Air Force. It's been in operation since April 2004. The squadron's technical group ensures that the modern combat aircraft are mission-ready at all times. When the pilots return from their sorties, lasting almost 2 hours, the aircraft mechanics of the maintenance squadron immediately take them into the shelter for inspection.
The aircraft is now returned after the first flight and is now scheduled for the second round. Accordingly, we are now performing an intermediate flight inspection, the first and second maintenance engineer. Accordingly, every inch of the aircraft undergoes a complete visual inspection. I generally look to see whether any damage has occurred to the aircraft during the flight, are any bolts missing, did anything come loose during the high forces exerted, have any leaks occurred. Then I look at all the systems, checking everything out. I look at the fluid levels, they're checked and topped if necessary. The aircraft is then refueled.
A sense of responsibility, in-depth technical understanding, and conscientious work are basic requirements in daily operations with the Eurofighter weapons system. Refueling the jet takes just under 5 minutes. The Eurofighter can also be refueled in flight via a retractable probe and drogue. This makes flying longer missions possible. The mechanics are also responsible for checking the large air intakes. Damage could have occurred here due to foreign objects, but also due to birds being sucked in. Prior to takeoff, the Eurofighter pilot and his maintenance engineer go over the aircraft one last time and check all the important components. Not only the mechanical systems play a key role, but also the avionics. The Eurofighter is no ordinary combat aircraft. It's a supersonic high-performance computer with wings. Once both are convinced that the jet is 100% ready for action, the pilot prepares for takeoff. On his helmet is the helmet visor. This projects all important data directly in front of his eyes, regardless of his line of vision.
In the takeoff phase, which is more or less the last check before the aircraft goes up into the air, the pilot sits in the cockpit, the maintenance engineer is down below, and they go over all the faults together. In some circumstances, a fault may crop up down below that the pilot cannot see way up in the cockpit. The pilot and the maintenance crew then reach an agreement. Can the aircraft fly, yes or no?
Since its foundation, the German Air Force has been subject to constant change. Time and again, it has had to adapt to global and strategic conditions. More than 100 years ago, the military began to conquer the skies. Progress was then advanced by war. When the First World War breaks out in August 1914, aircraft have existed for only a few years. Germany marches through the neutral countries of Belgium and Luxembourg and invades France. But the German offensive ends at the Marne. This is where mobile warfare turns into trench warfare. Large-scale battles of attrition and material seek to wear down the enemy. The consequence? For only minimal gains in terrain, hundreds of thousands of soldiers perish on the battlefields. Thus, the idea of a completely new theater of war is born: the air. Aircraft are initially used for reconnaissance flights over the fronts. Equipped with the then modern high-resolution aerial cameras, they're able to scout the enemy's deployments and positions. The Rumpler C-4 is a classic example of a reconnaissance and multi-role combat aircraft from the First World War. About 2,000 planes in various versions were built. The Rumpler C-4 can climb to about 6,000 to 7,000 meters and stay in the air for up to 4 hours. Ideal for a reconnaissance plane. But the high-altitude reconnaissance planes were not invulnerable for long.
In 1915, the French began building single-seat fighters and equipping them with machine guns. And they were designed with a rigid machine gun pointing in the longitudinal direction of the aircraft, so that the pilot was able to take aim with his entire plane. The German side, seeking to urgently respond in kind, initially equipped its double-seaters with movable machine guns, so that the observer had an MG. And then they did the same thing that the French did by introducing their own so-called one-seater fighter planes.
The Fokker E-4 was the first thoroughbred German fighter aircraft.
The problem is that if the machine gun does what it's supposed to do, which is shoot forward, the propeller also does what it's supposed to do, which is to turn forward. That poses somewhat of a structural problem. The pilot ran the risk of shooting up his own propeller. And the Germans, specifically the Fokker plant in Schwerin, succeeded in solving this riddle by running an ellipse in sync with the propeller. Whenever the propeller was right in front of the machine gun, the mechanism prevented the MG from firing, and this enabled the machine gun to shoot through the spinning propeller.
With these planes, military pilots are turned into fighter pilots. Probably the most famous of them all was Manfred von Richthofen, who became known as the Red Baron. His red-painted Fokker DR-1 is a copy of the British Sopwith triplane. The maneuverable triplane also sparks the mystique surrounding Richthofen and all the other fighter pilots.
They're young, and they have the success to show for it. But the problem is, I need to do something that makes military sense, something worthwhile. But I also have to be able to sell it. And when an observer has taken 4,000 high-resolution aerial photos, anyone with a camera at home will say to themselves, that can't be too hard. But if someone has shot down 20 planes, that is something everyone can identify with. 40 planes, 60 planes, 80 planes, an incredible success. Whether it was very important from a military standpoint is another matter entirely. Those are measurable propaganda successes for the people back home, and above all, it's all about the individual, a warrior, the archetype of a warrior, the master of technology who practically wages man-to-man combat here in the plane.
In addition to the fighters, another new type of aircraft is emerging: the bomber. The more stable and powerful the aircraft become, the more weapon systems and payloads they're able to carry. This allows them to load more and more bombs and fight the enemy far behind the front lines. Bombers spread fear and terror, and the bombs no longer distinguish between civilians and soldiers. Blackout measures, anti-aircraft guns, searchlight batteries. These are all measures used in the Second World War to fend off enemy bombings. But they all already existed in the First World War. Especially the British bundle all their air defense measures and are able to protect their country successfully against hostile German bombers. In January 1918, the Germans once again raised the ante with their brand new Fokker D-7. Shortly before the end of the war, German pilots are then in possession of what is probably the best fighter aircraft at that time. The D-7 is maneuverable and fast. At the same time, it's extremely easy to fly. Another advantage is its enormous climbing ability, which it owes to the BMW 3A high-altitude engine with overcompression. Even the Fokker D-7 can no longer shape the outcome of the war. The German Empire is in shambles, and the war is lost. In November 1918, the German High Command signs an armistice. The plane was so superior that in the Peace Treaty of Versailles, the surrender of all Fokker D-7s is made a specific condition.
At
the end of the First World War, the Peace Treaty of Versailles was devastating for the German Air Force and for the German aviation industry, because the Peace Treaty of Versailles stipulated that Germany was to no longer have an air force at all.
On January 21st, 1919, the German Air Force is officially disbanded. Aircraft and aircraft engines, still in existence, have to be handed over to the Allies. Even the construction of civilian aircraft is strictly regulated. Many German companies discontinue aircraft production or relocate abroad. The Treaty of Versailles limits the German Reichswehr, or Imperial Army, to 100,000 men. Many of the former war pilots try to find a job in the so-called Free Corps or as civilian pilots.
When civilian air traffic was once again allowed during the 1920s, we can assume that a large proportion of the pilots were trained in this way, and also that the types of aircraft introduced were designed to also be available to the military if need be. And in the case of the small training planes for German commercial flight schools, those flying machines were not much different from military planes to begin with. In other words, basic flight training took place here.
Training aircraft like this Udet U-12 Flamingo are used for this purpose. A total of roughly 200 aircraft are built of the biplane produced by the former fighter pilot Ernst Udet. Made of wood, the Flamingo is powered by a 7-cylinder 160-horsepower radial engine. The maximum speed of the 800-kilogram aircraft is 140 kilometers per hour. Neuburg on the Danube. The pilots of the German Air Force Squadron 74 also use flight simulators for training and to maintain their operational readiness. These modern devices adapt to the needs of the pilots. They allow for totally realistic scenarios of surroundings and mission parameters. These are developed by active and former pilots, like Franz Mennling. He was a fighter pilot and squadron captain.
There's a unit of the German armed forces here that is compiling a database based on satellite imagery, based on photographs, and so depending on the area where we're flying, whether it's Bodo in Norway or in the Baltics or in Beja in Portugal, wherever we can obtain those photos, that database, and we can build our own scenario on that. With flight zones, with enemy aircraft, if we know who's on an exercise, after all, we know what tactics they're flying.
The simulator is an exact replica of the 2.5-meter-long Eurofighter cockpit, including all original instruments and a deactivated ejection seat. Only the cockpit canopy was omitted. Several simulators can be linked. This enables the training of joint missions.
Especially flight maneuvers that we do outside, live weapons drills, for instance, where we simply have such high safety regulations. And it's good that we do, that are simply not very feasible in real flight, or can only be achieved with an immense amount of time and effort. They can be practiced multiple times in the simulator. That's also a cost saving that naturally should make the taxpayer especially happy, because we're getting our training that we need in order to demonstrate the readiness that we require at a lower cost.
We can't prove the contribution we're making towards preventing an aviation accident, but we are, and you can't measure that. Here in the simulator, we want to break the chain of events that leads to an aviation accident. We want to train people. We have over 500 emergency scenarios we can run. We can bring any pilot to the brink of despair. And the pilots can also practice shooting their way out of here, too. Yeah, or they'll crash. But we don't want to do that outside. This is what we are trying to prevent here.
Despite the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, enthusiasm for aviation continues unabated in Germany. Training and flying takes place in the early 1930s on training gliders. January 30th, 1933 marks the beginning of a new era. Adolf Hitler seizes power and is appointed Reich Chancellor. In the following May, he already establishes the Reich Aviation Ministry. From then on, Germany begins an arms buildup. Also, in violation of the Versailles Treaty, airfields, aerial warfare schools, and armaments companies are springing up in no time at all.
And thus, this German Air Force, which actually did not exist in 1933, grew to a strength of around 4,200 operational aircraft by the beginning of the war. And that was before mass mobilization, with numbers of nearly 300,000 men. And those were the peacetime forces. During the war, during mobilization, the German Air Force built up to a strength of over 2 million men.
Minister of Aviation Hermann Göring becomes the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. He was a World War I fighter pilot and close confidant of Adolf Hitler. His mission is to prepare the troops for war as quickly as possible. In 1939, with some 4,000 aircraft and state-of-the-art technology in all areas, the German Air Force is the most powerful air force in the world. When Hitler's Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Luftwaffe paves the way. It works closely with the rapidly advancing army units, establishing combined arms. A relatively new type of aircraft is also introduced, the dive bomber.
The so-called dive bombers had far greater pinpoint accuracy. They did nothing but swoop down on the target, release the bomb, and, in an age of non-intelligent munitions, dropping plain steel bombs, were able to hit targets much more precisely than a horizontal bomber could. The disadvantage was that this dive bomber, specifically the Junkers Ju-87, designed precisely for this purpose, lacked the capability of carrying a large number of bombs, and naturally did not have the bomb payloads that the He-111 had.
The Heinkel He-111 serves as a standard bomber. A medium heavy-duty bomber built entirely of metal and with a bomb load of about 2,000 kilograms. The bomber, capable of flying roughly 400 kilometers per hour, is flown by a four-man crew. Equipped with a full-view cockpit, the He-111 is used as a day and night bomber. Its range with bomb load is about 2,900 kilometers. The Polish defenders have very little to offer against the modern-equipped Wehrmacht. Hitler wins a quick victory, and the term Blitzkrieg is born. As a reaction to the invasion, France and England declare war on the German Reich. On April 9, 1940, Hitler invades Norway and Denmark. This is where the Germans deploy one of their newest weapons, paratroopers and airborne troops. By this time, it has become obvious just how important transport aircraft like the Junkers Ju-52 are. The main task of the three-engine Junkers Ju-52-3M is transport. But it's also used as a makeshift bomber. Its maximum range is 1,300 kilometers. Reliable and robust, the Ju-52 is a critical aircraft working on all fronts of the Second World War. In the Western campaign against France, German strategists once again rely on the close coordination between the Luftwaffe and ground units. Shielded from the air by the most modern fighter plane of the era, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. The compact low-wing aircraft has a speed of around 600 kilometers per hour and a range of about 800 kilometers. It owes its high-flying performance to features that are not standard at the time. Fuselage in shell construction, self-supporting wings, and a 12-cylinder high-performance engine. In the Bf-109E version, the fighter is armed with 2 machine guns and 2 automatic cannons. France also falls within a few weeks and signs the Armistice Treaty on June 22, 1940, also in Compiègne and in the same railway carriage as Germany at the end of the First World War in 1918. But Adolf Hitler and his generals are already planning the next attack. And once again, the Luftwaffe is to play a pivotal role. On June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht invades the Soviet Union. Again, the Luftwaffe fights in close coordination with the 3 army groups leading the attack. And, as in previous campaigns, the Germans begin bombing airfields to destroy the majority of Soviet aircraft on the ground. But by the end of 1941, the German offensive has already come to a standstill. Hitler's Blitzkrieg hopes prove to be pure wishful thinking.
And then the Soviet counteroffensive began. And from 1943-44, the Germans can no longer act but only react. And that applied equally to the Luftwaffe, which meant that because a large share of the Luftwaffe flying personnel, aircraft, but also anti-aircraft artillery was on the Eastern Front, logically, very little was in the German Reich itself. And you basically had the homeland, the German Reich, stripped of planes, and in parts also of flak. That would soon reap bitter consequences.
In 1943, after losing the Battle of Stalingrad, the German Wehrmacht is in retreat on all fronts. The Allied landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944, marks the beginning of the final stage in the destruction of Nazi Germany. The war is now being brought to Germany, mainly by the Allied bomber fleet. Unlike the German Luftwaffe, from the beginning, Britain and the United States rely on heavy strategic bombers. These are now penetrating deep into Hitler's Reich in swarms of over 1,000 planes and laying German cities and industrial plants in ruins. The airspace over Germany is firmly in Allied hands. The German fighters deployed for defense are unable to stop the bombers. No other war combatant is equipped with more anti-aircraft guns than Germany. But there's a shortage of soldiers. For that reason, German flak is operated mainly by conscripted civilians. And from the age of 15, even young people are called up as flak helpers. Those who do not make it into the large air raid shelters seek refuge in the so-called one-man bomb shelters. They offer modest protection for 1 or 2 people. Almost unopposed, the Allies fly their missions on German cities. With so-called wonder weapons, Hitler seeks to turn the war around. The V1, V, standing for Vergeltung or retaliation, is directed against the British civilian population. It's intended to demoralize the British through fear and terror. On June 13, 1944, the first V1 rocket is launched in the direction of England. The V2, developed by Wernher von Braun, is a rocket-propelled missile fired for the first time against London on September 7, 1944. By the end of the war, more than 3,000 V2 missiles had been launched. 8,000 people were killed, yet the new missiles failed to influence the course of the war. Another new so-called wonder weapon is the Messerschmitt Me-262. It's the world's first fully operational fighter jet and clearly superior to enemy aircraft. Flying up to an altitude of 11,500 meters, it reaches a top speed of nearly 900 kilometers per hour. But the fighter jet arrives too late. There is a shortage of pilots and, above all, of fuel for the gas-guzzling turbines of the Me-262. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet, also referred to as Kraftei or Power Egg, is also no longer of decisive significance in the war. The world's first rocket-propelled fighter accelerates to nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. The rocket turbine allows the light aircraft to climb to 12,000 meters within 3 minutes. However, the burn time of the engine is only 7.5 minutes. And the small Me 163 only has a minimal range and was supposed to be used as a ground combat support fighter that only scramble when enemy bombers are in the immediate vicinity. At the beginning of May 1945, Nazi Germany is finally defeated. The Second World War left behind 60 million dead and a Europe in ruins.
The German Wehrmacht surrendered unconditionally between May 7th and May 9th, 1945. And that basically says everything in terms of the contribution to the further development here. The four allies, the Americans, the French, the British, and the Soviet Union took power over the government and the administration in Germany.
The Allies had already negotiated the new order of Europe in February 1945. Divided up into 4 occupation zones, Germany was to be comprehensively demilitarized, denazified, and ultimately democratized. The war between the United States and Japan ends in August 1945 with the first use of atomic bombs. The Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are turned into atomic embers. The Second World War transitions seamlessly into a new war, a Cold War. The front line between the Communist East and the capitalist West runs straight through Germany. In 1946, Churchill speaks of an Iron Curtain dividing Europe into 2 blocks. In 1949, 2 German states are founded, the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. But still without an army, but soon with armed forces. In the Federal Republic, the Federal Border Guard, and in the GDR, the Barracked People's Police.
There was the formation of an airborne police force, which was essentially the predecessor of the air defense of the National People's Army of the GDR. There was a similar development with the Federal Border Guard on the western side. It sounded like border security at first. They too were armed, equipped, outfitted militarily, and in the year 1950 there were considerations in West Germany. Officially, of course, it was still secret. The topic was off limits, but they were exploring the question of what might a West German defense contribution look like.
On May 6, 1955, the Federal Republic of Germany joins the Western NATO Defense Alliance and the Bundeswehr is founded. The newly created army should also have an air force. Here, support comes from the United States, the new world power.
The initial pilot training was basically done by the U.S. Air Force in Germany. In Landsberg am Lech and in Fürstenfeldbruck, the pilots for prop planes and jets were retrained, so to speak, because the first ones who were trained there had already been airmen during the war. And then starting in 1957, fighter-bomber training commenced in the United States, because they were already flying American patterns.
Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Heiner Müllers is a military historian of the German armed forces. He conducts in-depth research on its history. The Lockheed T-33A is the first jet aircraft of the new German Air Force. Within the framework of mutual arms assistance, the USA supplied 192 aircraft to the young German armed forces. The jet trainer is almost 12 meters long and flew at speeds greater than 800 kilometers per hour. Its range was around 2,000 kilometers. The plane's proverbial reliability earned the T-33A the nickname VW of the air. Due to the low fuel consumption, the pilots were able to remain in the air for up to 4.5 hours.
Im Juli 1956 beginnen diese deutschen Fluglehrer mit der Ausbildung eigener Piloten der Bundeswehr.
Following basic flight training, the jet pilots complete their advanced training. Special focus is placed on group flying in close formation, behavior in dangerous situations, and instrument and night flying. In the GDR as well, people are marching again. In the spring of 1950, the Soviet Union calls for the creation of an East German army based on the Soviet model. This includes an air force. Packed in crates, some MiG-15 fighter planes arrive in the GDR from the Soviet Union to train East German pilots. The 10-meter-long all-metal fighter bomber flies at speeds of around 1,000 kilometers per hour. However, its operating radius is severely limited to only 650 kilometers. The fighter is armed with 3 cannons, plus either unguided missiles or 2 bombs. Its ceiling is 15,000 meters. The main assignment of the NVA Air Force is the protection of the airspace over the territory of the GDR. For this purpose, a tight-knit network of surveillance points is established over the territory of the GDR. An alarm is sounded virtually every day.
Zum Beispiel war ein Anlass zur Alarmauslösung.
For example, an event that triggered an alarm was when NATO military aircraft approached the border. They could be reconnaissance planes, but they could also be fighter bombers.
Das konnten Jagdbomber sein.
Like the Starfighter, for example. On July 14, 1960, the first Starfighter flight took place over German territory. Its most important job, carrying a tactical nuclear weapon. The Starfighter needed hardly 1 minute to go from 0 to 1,000 kilometers per hour. Its top speed was above Mach 2, and its range was almost 1,800 kilometers. The pilot's workplace was stripped down and cramped, and the fighter bomber had an uncomfortably hard seat. The NATO strategy of the 1950s was one of so-called massive retaliation. In the event of an attack, according to the Warsaw Treaty, NATO could have responded at any time with the use of nuclear bombs.
Even at that time, it was already foreseeable that the nuclear role would be an essential task. The Starfighter was best suited for the job.
Retired Colonel Gerd Overhoff is a Starfighter pilot from day one. After attending officers' training school, he goes to Canada for further training. In the USA, he then learns how to handle the Starfighter. The officer quickly rises through the ranks, squadron captain, commodore, then positions in the Ministry of Defense and NATO headquarters in Brussels. Based on his own experience, the colonel can best assess the biggest concern to the German Air Force in the 1960s, the Starfighter Crisis. Since 1962, there's an increasing number of crashes involving this aircraft in the German armed forces. In 1965 alone, 15 pilots lose their lives in 26 crashes. It's referred to in the vernacular as the Widowmaker.
Looking back, there were, in my view, 3 factors that ultimately caused the Starfighter crisis to come to a head. It was inexperience on all 3 levels. The first level, the leadership of the German Air Force. Its general officers were still from the Second World War, and it had no experience with such a high-performance Mach 2 jet. And the second field was that of technology. The technical department also had to deal with new equipment and determine which components were particularly sensitive. All that takes time. And the third inexperience was that of the pilots, because all the pilots were young. We still had far too little experience in handling such a racehorse.
On September 2, 1966, the former Luftwaffe fighter pilot and May 262 pilot, Lieutenant General Johannes Steinhoff, becomes the third inspector of the German Air Force. He is supposed to finally end the Starfighter Crisis.
With his authority and expertise, Johannes Steinhoff managed to make it clear in the political arena and in the public perception that it was not the aircraft that was the problem, but the overall conditions. And the interesting thing is that we had none of the problems similar to the Starfighter problems with all the other weapon systems. So we learned quite a lot from this whole organizational problem.
During the Cold War, the F-4 Phantom was one of NATO's most important fighter jets. It began its service with the German Armed Forces on January 20th, 1971, as a reconnaissance aircraft and fighter bomber. Its mission? In the event of an emergency, it's supposed to ensure the complete and timely reconnaissance of all enemy activities and a proper forward defense, with a bomb payload of up to 7,200 kilograms.
Die Piloten, die sich hier zum Flug fertig machen, gehören dem Jagdgeschwader 74 Mölders aus Neuburg an, das direkt der NATO unterstellt ist. Beim Tiefflug mit etwa 800 Kilometern in der Stunde muss die Übungsbombe in ein Netz abgeworfen werden. Ebenso genau muss mit der Bordkanone getroffen werden. Die Trefferzahl wird automatisch an den Tower übermittelt.
During its service life, the F-4 Phantom repeatedly undergoes extensive modernization measures. For example, it's equipped with hardpoints for the deployment of air-to-air missiles, or Maverick missiles, a digital weapons computer, and state-of-the-art radar. In its day, the aircraft is the most modern flying weapons system and was in service with the German Armed Forces for over 40 years. It wasn't decommissioned until 2013. An irrational arms race ensues between East and West during the Cold War. On the Western side, several NATO countries joined forces to develop what was described at the time as the largest arms project in living memory. It's the new flexible weapons system, the Tornado. Almost 17 meters long, weighing 28 tons, and traveling at more than 2,300 kilometers per hour, the fighter bomber has a range of almost 2,800 kilometers. Its main task is to engage enemy land and air forces. The twin-engine fighter bomber is equipped with variable sweep wings. These provide for an extremely short takeoff and landing capability. And unlike any other military jet, it has extensive mission versatility. Close air support, battlefield air interdiction in the hinterland, or the engagement of maritime targets are but a few of its many mission capabilities. In terms of weapons systems, the Tornado has two 27mm cannons and the capability of carrying some 9,000 kilograms of bombs as an external load. Another European joint development, in this case between Germany and France, is the Alpha jet. Within the German Air Force, it was used as a light fighter bomber and mission training aircraft from 1980 to 1997. The Alpha jet replaces the underperforming Fiat G91. Its top speed is 995 kilometers per hour, and its range 900 kilometers. In combat, the Alpha jet is designed to support ground troops while engaging tanks and helicopters. Tactical reconnaissance is handled by the Starfighter, Phantom, and later also the Tornado.
Bei einem begrenzten örtlichen Angriff in Mitteleuropa müssen nach dem Beginn von Feindseligkeiten so schnell wie möglich verlässliche Unterlagen über Art und Umfang des feindlichen Aufmarsches zur Verfügung stehen, um eine rasche und angemessene Bündnisreaktion auszulösen.
The Tornado and the Starfighter are ideally suited for this purpose. For aerial reconnaissance, they're equipped with high-resolution optical cameras and wide-area infrared scanners. Their job is to scout enemy troop movements and the enemy command structure.
Of course, the command posts were secret sites, but they were known. It was always only a matter of time before a site the other side had gone to great lengths to keep secret would be revealed after all. There are a few examples, especially on the GDR side. They did everything they could to simply keep it as secret as possible. The construction measures took an endless amount of time, because they were not allowed to acknowledge that there were lanes somewhere and trucks were always driving there. But there was no construction activity, so, it's a secret site. These are the small clues where covert operators were able to determine that something was there and focus their attention on it. At the end of the day, both sides had a fairly good idea as to who the key decision makers were. And if the button had been pressed, they would all have been instantly eliminated. Because we were dealing with the threat of nuclear terror. And the bottom line is that no one survives it.
Helmut Schmidt is reported to have said, when the first atomic bomb falls on Germany, he would raise the white flag, because then a war would have been absurd.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 also ends the Cold War.
This development came as a surprise in the summer of 1989, and the speed at which events unfolded with the GDR collapsing, not to mention the then newly formed 5 East German states joining the territory of the Federal Republic, including the international treaties involved, I don't think it was possible to plan for that at all. So this came as a complete surprise to many people. And you can also see from the attitudes of the politicians at the time that they were actually completely surprised every morning at what was now on the agenda.
With the reunification of Germany, the history of the Air Force and air defense of the GDR ends on October 3, 1990. The entire National People's Army, NVA, is disbanded and the material sold or scrapped. One of the very few exceptions is the ultra-modern Russian MiG-29. From the end of July 1991, the fighter is officially part of the German Air Force's fleet. The German armed forces take over 24 MiG-29 planes and fly them between 1991 and 2004. In the process, the MiG-29 significantly improves our understanding of enemy weapon systems and makes a lasting contribution towards the advancement of Western tactics. Meanwhile, the tasks and requirements of the German Air Force are also changing.
The adversary collapsed. This initially led to various structural upheavals and changes. But what was interesting was that Germany, after reunification, did not have such a special status as the GDR and the Federal Republic did previously, for example, in the United Nations. Because as a reunified Germany, if you are a fully sovereign member of an alliance, then you basically have to be able and willing to contribute just as much as Bangladesh or Pakistan. And that is what Helmut Kohl said in his government policy statement on October 3rd. We will now create the conditions to allow us to do full justice to our international mission.
The German Air Force is and will remain indispensable for Germany's security policy. It monitors Germany's airspace and keeps quick response combat aircraft units on standby to ensure sovereignty in the air. And the German Air Force participates in relief, rescue, and evacuation missions at home and abroad.
We are completing missions in Afghanistan with our transport helicopter and with our reconnaissance drone. We are participating in counter-Daesh, the fight against ISIS. Here we are flying from Jordan via Iraq and Syria with our A400M transport aircraft, taking on the role as a tanker. That means we are refueling other fighter jets that are still fighting ISIS.
The German Air Force always flexibly adapts its operational readiness to the situation as it develops. It makes its contribution in the event of armed conflicts. But since the Crimean crisis in 2014, its focus has shifted once again.
We have to demonstrate that we can defend ourselves. In the years prior, the focus was on international crisis management and foreign missions. Now we are once again involved in national and alliance defense. The German government has stated clearly that we have both the duty and the desire to once again become capable of defending the nation and the alliance.